Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 15th episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reed, and today we are joined with my friend, Andrew Satz, who is the co founder and CEO of Evolve. Thank you for your time today, Andrew.
Great to be here, Dylan. Thanks so much for having me.
And when did you realize that you wanted to contribute to the field of AI by expediting the drug approval process?
Yeah, so I went to grad school for data science. And when I exited grad school, what I saw was that about two-thirds to three-quarters of all data scientists were one of two fields. They were in marketing or finance. Google's marketing is selling you more clicks. So Google still makes close to 90%, 80 to 90% of its money off of AdWords. So a lot of big tech companies are making money off of ads. So their goal is to get it click more. And so data scientists are really there. We're there to get you more click more. The other big portion were in finance. I didn't want to take the skills that I learned and operate in those spaces. Like data scientists are arguably some of the most advanced technologists out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seemed like, how can I do things with this skill set that I had that could really be more impactful on the world? And my co-founder agreed with that, who I'd also met at grad school. And so what we did was we looked at the opportunities that were out there, and about less than 5% of all data scientists were in the healthcare ecosystem, and that included both healthcare as we know it and then pharma, biotech. But that, a 5% of the group applying to 20% of GDP, right? Because healthcare is 20% of the annual spend in the United States, and so there was a big gap there, and so we decided to start a AI for healthcare consulting firm to try to explore where in the space we thought we could have the most impact.
Mm-hmm.
And we did work for accountable care organizations, payers, providers. Got hired by a hospice to predict when patients would die. And then we got hired by a biotech to help them teach machines to read a certain kind of scan called a PET scan.
Mm-hmm.
And then they asked us to do stuff that didn't relate at all to AI. Strategy, help them with strategy, help them with operations. I'm a serial entrepreneur or habitual entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And my co-founder comes from finance. So we were like, as long as we're learning and earning, we're happy to do it. And we helped bring 3 drugs from discovery to clinic. And seeing the process of turning a molecule into something that you can inject into humans and all the failure that comes about, thought that we could model some of that in the computer. And that's actually what drove us to really apply AI to drug discovery, thinking about how do we reduce these failure rates so that we can better distribute the resources for medicine and maybe see more medicines approved, which will help more patients. And so the other side of it is that if you can really drive the cost down of medicine, of driving medicine into the clinic or beyond, then a lot of the diseases, and I think it's something like 95% of rare diseases, childhood rare diseases, don't have a treatment, right? And the reason for that is that it's just not economically viable to create a medicine for those diseases. You can think of the children and their families suffering, and so it's really like, how do we reduce that? So that's what really drove us. It drives us every day to accelerate the speed that we can get medicine to patients by driving down the costs to the point that it becomes easier for researchers and drug hunters and people that actually care about the diseases to bring a therapeutic to market.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up an interesting point because, one of the things that I've really have learned by applying AI in the drug discovery process is that you're able to discover a lot more molecules than kind of the conventional way that drug discovery has been going. You could argue for about 40 to 50 years.
Yeah, one thing that is possible is to test a lot more drugs, and then test them across multiple stages at the same time. So in the data science world, we might call that multi-parameter optimization, right? You're because the drug discovery process is a very linear process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Test this one thing. If it passes this test, test the next thing, test the next thing, test the next thing. And you might get to test number 49 and it fails. And then you might have to go back to the drawing board and start again. And so what the machines allow us to do is test across multiple parameters so that maybe, you can't test for everything in the computer, not today. But maybe you can test for something that happens downstream and prevent that from being the cause for that drug, from eliminate that molecule because it just won't make it past that step. It could survive all the other steps, but it might not make it to that one. And so, maybe, right now the testing and the animal testing, we as an industry haven't modeled how to do animal testing. You're starting to see like organs on a chip and tumors on a chip. And so will the FDA accept those? They are supposedly going to, but we haven't seen that
Mm-hmm.
translate yet. And so there are other ways besides AI, right, that you can use to model these processes.
Mm-hmm. And if is the reason why that we haven't gone from from testing on animals to chips, is it an excuse me, is it an expense thing, or is it just not something that's particularly popular? Kind of where's the miscommunication?
So first off, let me share, this is not my area of expertise. So
Uh-huh.
I'm going to share my hypothesis, and as well informed as I am, as informed as I am, or poorly informed as I am. Um, there are significant hurdles
Mm-hmm.
to get to there, right? You need proof of equivalency,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't think, and the organs on a chip are in the early stages,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have systems on a chip, right? So when you're testing in an animal, you're testing in a broader system that is supposedly a representation of what might happen in a human. Now, historically, like, if 90% of drugs fail to reach, that get into clinical trials, fail to reach approval, assuming that all of that was scientifically related,
Mm-hmm.
then that means that animal models are only effective 10% of the time. I mean, again, this is not my area of expertise, but, and I'm realizing that there are a whole bunch of reasons why drugs fail to make it to clinic. It could be, beyond just safety. It can be efficacy issues. It, can be strategy changes. It can be financial reasons. There's a lot of reasons why drugs fail. But if you just took the big number, right, and just said, okay, well, then it only works 10% of the time. And so you have a model
Mm-hmm.
that's not good, and you're trying to compare to you're trying to compare those organs to a model that's not good. So, you know, some of these, a lot of clinical trial research focuses on, especially the safety side, like liver toxicity, right? So liver's on a chip, right? Can we
Mm-hmm.
can we test these 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 drugs on, artificial livers, and then you can sort of see how it impacts distribution and other types of ways that the drug is taken up in the body. But again, it only represents one organ. And let's say, for example, you're testing a drug for lung cancer, right? How do you? Not an expert in the space, but like, how do you test for the cancer at the same time as testing for the toxicity, right? And what
Mm-hmm.
you see in animal models, they'll xenograft,
Mm-hmm.
which, if you're familiar with that term, um, they'll sort of attach the cancer to the animal, uh, and then dose that animal with the drug to see if that animal responds. And it's, you're seeing the sort of shrinkage of the tumor. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is so there's a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of, and also animal testing is an old process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and organs on a chip and tumors on a chip are fairly new. So, yeah.
Yeah, because what's the saying is that you can have the best model in the world, but if you have bad data, it's still going to be a bad model.
Correct. Or you can have a really bad model and have really great data, right? So it can go the other way. It can go both. And, I think it's also important to distinguish models versus algorithms in that state, right? Like, um, you know, an animal model is a model,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in the case of the computer models, the models could be wrong. And are they wrong because the data was bad? Are they wrong because the algorithm wasn't the right algorithm, or wasn't the best algorithm, or wasn't an accurate algorithm to predict what's going on?
Mm-hmm. And How would you like evolve to positively contribute to the conversation of the drug discovery process here in the United States?
Yes. So, one thing we try to do at Evolve is make AI easily accessible to uh, discovery researchers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in terms of what we try to do, is there's a big learning curve, right, in the space, because you have the biology side and then you have the computational side, right? So if you're coming to the computational side, the biology side is a big steep learning curve. If you're coming from the biology side, the machine learning, statistics, probability, right, all that stuff is a heavy linear algebra. It's a heavy learning curve. And then thinking about it from like the applied lens as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're trying to do is bridge that divide. Um, Scientists are really, really good at doing science.
Mm-hmm.
We consider ourselves experts at applying AI
Mm-hmm.
to to the to the field of antibody biology. And so if we can do that, then we make it so that the work that the scientists are doing, who are experts in the disease, who are experts in protein engineering, who are experts in drug development, we can give them that resource, right? You can imagine, like, for example, if I had a calculator in my hand and I were to time travel back to, the early 1800s. Like, I don't need to teach people how to use the calculator. I just use the calculator for them. And so, like, if you distribute that across people, that's kind of the way that we think about it. It's trying to make this easily accessible to others, right? Because we're dealing with technology that, I'm not saying that the scientists are like, you know 100 years behind, but it's moving so quickly that it's hard to stay on top of both the recent advances in biology and the advances in machine learning, and being able to figure out how to apply them. So we act as that external arm to support them in that process.
Mm-hmm. Now, like pre-evolved, um, was there like were other companies doing kind of what Evolve is doing in the drug approval and discovery process, or are you guys kind of like revolutionary in the space?
So there are there were companies doing drug discovery, AI for drug discovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was most of them seem to have the early ones seem to have been born sometime around 2015. They were focused on a particular a type of drug called small molecules, and there were some really powerful advances in translating what we were seeing in image recognition
Mm-hmm.
into the small molecule space. Um, and I'll try to explain a little bit of that history for you if it's helpful. But small molecules, they're like 25 to 50 atoms.
Mm-hmm.
Antibodies are 25,000 to 50,000 atoms, right? So you're talking about orders of magnitude larger. Biologics in general are much larger. So there was the way that machine learning, deep learning, actually, let me talk more about that. The way that deep learning started was that the computers were sort of looking across the various pixels across an image. You can imagine like the computer kind of reading the pixels across the top of the screen, right? Like looking at each of the pixels and looking at the relationship between a pixel and the pixel next to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it does this over time, over the course of the image, and then it'll expand to larger groups. So instead of like maybe a 4 by 4, it'll go to 8 by 8, it'll go to like 16 by 16. It'll just get bigger until it understands the nature of what's happening in the image. And this was done with images of cats early on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what some really smart people did was they realized that they could take a pixel and put it into a three-dimensional space called a voxel,
Okay.
and then you could put you can like represent an individual atom, right? Carbon, nitrogen, name it. And now, instead of thinking like pixels right next to each other, you can use their sort of distance in space. It becomes a very computationally complex problem, because in a pixel space, it's literally right next to one another. There's no sort of distance relationship. But as you add each atom on, right, you have the atom, and then where it sits in space, which could be, if you're thinking about it from a three-dimensional perspective, it could be like a 360 thing. Some genius figured out that you could stick the atoms in there, and that's what started this sort of revolution in AI for drug discovery for small molecules. Now you can do that for 25 to 50 atoms. because, well, the way that works is that, each time you add on another one, you're adding on another set of computational complexity, the number of calculations that you would need to do to understand its space. When you're dealing with biologics, that wasn't really possible because 25 to 50,000, computational complexity in 360 space is just like, which is not doable by computers. So around 2009, around 2020, you started to see more companies pop up in the biologic space, and there was a bunch of different reasons why. You know, there were ways to do epistasis was really like what evolve was based on early on, was this evolutionary algorithms. Could we model evolution? And there's been other recent advances with protein language modeling that allowed it to do that. So there are other companies in space. The old were the original, like the old school,
Mm-hmm.
not that long ago, like less than a decade, about a decade or so ago,
Mm-hmm.
were the small molecules, and then biologics came about 5 years afterwards. So we
Mm-hmm.
were part of that biologics era, and there are other companies doing it. There are companies focused on leveraging these tools to design biologics. Antibodies are biologic drugs. They're not chemically. So the difference between small molecule and antibodies: small molecules are chemically synthesized drugs, biologics. Biologics are drugs that come from living things. Think of like insulin, which comes from the pancreas, right? As a biologic substance. So, and so there are other companies doing work. A lot of them are focused on developing their own internal pipelines. It's a company like Generate Biomedicines that really focuses heavily on developing drugs internally. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there are other companies that do traditional antibody discovery using
Mm-hmm.
immunization techniques of animals or display, and then they'll lay AI on top. We're a fully computational company. We very much focus on the computation to be a resource to research scientists around the world.
Okay. So I
I am
just
sorry
want
for that long answer.
no, no, don't, no, no, that's great. No, that's very helpful. So, kind of, and you brought up a great point. So basically, so in the drug discovery process, companies were like, kind of what we're seeing with generative AI and um, right now, they were already working on that like 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's an algorithm called a generative adversarial network, which was really great at teaching computers to play games,
Mm-hmm.
um, or image creation, right? And that's been around. Like the sort of the buzz that we've been seeing over the last year or so around you know generative models, large language models, it was really, in my view, like a user experience process, right? It made AI very, very accessible to people. Like
Mm-hmm.
OpenAI, like with ChatGPT, what they did was they basically created an interface where anybody could interact with the large language model. But the model on which it's based, so the T in GPT stands for transformer.
Mm-hmm.
That model was actually released by Google back in 2017, but it took a while. It took about 6 years for it to become something that you or I or anyone who's not a data scientist could use and
Mm-hmm.
actually see the impact that it can have in a
Mm-hmm.
very explicit way, in a way that was like surprising to most people. But like, we're interacting with these AI all the time. Like GPS is an AI system, right? We just don't think about it that way because it's not like an intelligence we can interact with. You can't have a conversation with your computer right now. You can have a conversation with your computer, right? Like, just go on Chat GPT and start talking to it, right? And so I think that changed, but the models themselves, the ability to do this stuff, it's been around for a while, and just you don't need the requisite probability statistics, machine learning training to be able to implement them nowadays. It became more of a user interface, user experience process. To kind of think about it like, if you wanted to build a website 20 years ago, you needed to learn, you know, CSS, HTML. If you want to build a web app, you needed to learn JavaScript. Today, you just go on Wix, right? And so you can kind of think about like website building in that same lens,
Mm-hmm.
right? Wix, or name any of your build your website for you, right? Squarespace. It's kind of like that, right? And so And now anybody could build a website
Mm-hmm.
with it. Just you don't need to be able to code. You just got to be able to drag and drop. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of, in my view, it's becoming more like that. And then you have all these people coming on board that don't they're not data scientists. They may be software engineers, and they're able to use these tools. OpenAI has its API that can make it usable. So these algorithms have been around for a while. That
Mm-hmm.
have, it's just the transformer model really changed how we as humans are able to interact with AI.
Mm-hmm. And you know, you bring up an interesting point, and it's something that I've really thought about this myself a little bit. Is it safe to say then, like these AI models, like I use Pi AI for example, which is very similar to ChatGPT. Do you kind of foresee when it comes to kind of the drug discovery process that these particular types of technology could eventually replace like Google search or Bing when it comes to, I have a headache, what drug should I take, or kind of, those types of questions?
I mean, yes, like eventually, I do think that the corpus of knowledge that allows you to self-diagnose will be to the point um, that we will have sort of digital doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I let me put a caveat there, right? I think that there's a fundamental difference between intelligence and consciousness and intelligence and creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you think about what doctors spend their first couple of years doing in medical schools that they're memorizing, and this is basically what the AIs are doing. They're memorizing. Um, but the issue is the sort of the lens of experience, and so until we have systems where there's a feedback mechanism into the AI about like, hey, you say you have a headache, and then you take a Tylenol, and your headache goes away, and then you tell the machine that, hey, my headache went away, then right, like, or it didn't go away, right, then we won't really have learning systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's also some issues, right, like around protected health information, and so there's a lot of overarching issues beyond just the technical sides of things, the regulatory, the information, the feedback mechanisms that like, hey, your doctor's going to ask you, do you feel better after they, like, hey, come back and check with me in 30 days. And they'll say, do you feel better? Now, if we can build that mechanism into that'd be great. But there are other issues, right? There's the regulatory side, but there's also the doctor, like the medical system itself that's going to that's going to act as a barrier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because change is hard, change
Mm-hmm.
is scary, and I think what we'll start to see eventually is the sort of hyper specialization
Mm-hmm.
of where doctors become more productive. I think that's actually what's going to be more exciting. Like in
Mm-hmm.
our lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
doctors becoming way more productive. What you asked is maybe something, I don't know how far off in the future it's going to happen where we'll have like a virtual doctor, right? Like a digital doctor. But it goes back to the statement I made about creativity, right? Like sometimes it's really hard to connect the dots,
Mm-hmm.
and that experience level of doctors really is what allows that to happen. And so what I think will happen in the near term is a significant increase in productivity of doctors,
Mm-hmm.
right? I was listening to a doctor talk the other day. He said that before electronic health records he could see about 60 patients a day. Post electronic health records he could see about 40 patients a day, because what happened was electronic health records created the most expensive data entry force in the history of humanity, right? You have these doctors that are just doing data entry. You can imagine in the near future where if you train a GPT model with the corpus of medical language, when doctors are, now using words
Hmm.
that aren't used by the common in the common English language, right? It's used in the medical language. Now the doctors can go back to what they used to do, which was just talk into something, and then someone else is transcribing, somewhere, right? Those recordings. You could just enter into the EHR just by talking to it, and it'll pick up the words the doctor's saying. And now you can increase the productivity in real time. And now doctors, really spend time with patients and just noting with a recorder or something like that. Um, and the AI can also ask for questions. It could potentially present doctors with some of the latest research, and so I think the thing is that will significantly increase productivity. That's actually where I think what we're seeing today in
Hmm.
the this transformational space around AI is really about productivity, increasing productivity.
Hmm. And no, that's a great point. And one last question I did have for you, Andrew, is what do you think Congress or elected officials need to understand about AI in the drug discovery process?
One of the biggest challenges, um, I think there's a couple different things I would think about. Like the first has to do with the fear, right? Like the the second would have to do with the regulatory process, right? So and the third is really around the data, right? The data state of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So let me take those in a kind of a um, kind of a reverse order, right? So one of the biggest hurdles to overcome in training these really advanced models, right? So there's basically four ways to get a machine learning model to work, right? You either have a better model, right, to get AI to work, right? You have a better model, you have a good model, you have a new model,
Mm-hmm.
you have a better model, you find new ways to represent the data, or you have more data. And that last one is very expensive and and in the case of healthcare, it's expensive, very well protected because you have like HIPAA um, rules, and and in many cases very inaccurate. Right? I read a study once that said, you know, electronic health records data is only 50% accurate. Um, so I think finding ways to make data accessible through the NIH, through clinical trial data, through aggregation of population health data from, regulatory bodies, through, results from Medicare and Medicaid, making that data more widely available and investing resources at a governmental level to be able to make those types of data sets more widely available, whether that's data that comes from research that's funded by the US government, um, because that's actually what's going to power the future models. That's what's going to power our ability to, you know, get better diagnoses. That's what's going to power the creation of specialized medicines for smaller populations that have diseases that are really passionate. You think about sort of the rare pediatric diseases. I mean, there's no more passionate advocate for transformation as a parent whose child is sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think on the data side, there needs to be some sort of effort put forth, because this is not something that can be done at a sort of at a private level. There's no financial incentive
Mm-hmm.
for these organizations to make their data available, right? Because in fact, there's disincentive, because then it potentially fuels a competitive drug.
Mm-hmm.
So that's on the data side. On the regulatory side, and I think the FDA is starting, like, has been doing this. I mean, under the guidance of Scott Gottlieb several years ago, there was a lot of work being done in modernizing the regulatory process. But I think that um, finding ways to allow for model substitutions. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. we talked about this earlier in our conversation, which was, you have organs on a chip substituting for, animal models. There's a lot of steps in the drug discovery process, right? I'm not sure familiar with the sort of the preclinical stage, but there's a filing called an IND. It's called an investigative new drug application. Investigational. I forget which version of it is for the I. I'm sure one of your audience members will correct me. But an IND, in essence, there's a few things that you need to have in it. You need to have safety data, toxicity data, and then you need to have CMC data. CMC in general means that you consistently make the molecule the same way every single time. There's other parts to it, but it's sort of like the overarching theme of it. And how do you prove that, right? Well, you make multiple batches, you do testing, you do all sorts of evidence that you're going to demonstrate to the FDA that this molecule is safe and that it's consistently made the same way. It's a very expensive process. Now, you can imagine that, and that you're doing a lot of lab testing, otherwise known as in vitro testing, to prove this. Well, what if I could actually make a perfect model of an in vitro test, right? Like 99% of the time, some with some p-value that it's consistently the same every single time, right? Then should I have to do that test in a lab, right? There's no mechanism for that right now. There's no mechanism to replace a lab test with a computational test. There's no mechanism to substitute an in vivo, an animal test with a model test. And like, we need to be thinking about it because this is coming, right? There, and the rationale behind it, from my perspective, is this is the pathway to personalized medicine. Because there's the sort of, we live in the world of panaceas right now, right? Tylenol for you, Tylenol for me, Tylenol for somebody else. Precision medicine is, Tylenol for you, Aleve for me, Advil for my neighbor, right? Because that's the one that's tuned to you based upon whatever factors we use to validate this. Personalized medicine is headache medicine for Dylan, headache medicine for Andrew, designed specifically for me. And the way to do that is, you need to, there's a lot of hurdles to get there, but in order to get there, you need something that can design a molecule for you, and you need it to be able to be designed in a way that's like, that it's going to be safe and effective, right? How do you do that without running a massive clinical trial? But I'm not trying to create a medicine for one person. And so, there needs to be regulatory shift. So that's the sort of second thing. And the third thing, I think, is fear. I remember when I was talking about, like, when I had the consulting company, I gave a talk to a group of technology innovators about how AI is going to impact healthcare. And, like, the first question I got was like, what about the Terminator? And so, right, like, I'm not minimizing, like, there is a rationale to be afraid of these types of things. But, like, the fact of the matter is, they're going to happen whether you're afraid of them or not. Right. And I think that, like, what we saw out of Europe was that is actually going to stifle innovation. If you find ways, it's because it's really, like, the compliance with those rules is really only something that, like, it's going to be hard for small companies to do. And you're going to find all these organizations that are going to pop up to try to comply with this, right? Like just like ESG, or, the research tax credits. I mean, like, look at accounting, right? Like, I can't do my taxes myself, right? I know, like, I need to hire somebody. And so you're going to create a new system. And I think the problem is that people are so afraid, especially those in Congress, whose job is not to, like, know about what's going on with AI, whose job is to, like, try to figure out like how do we, you know, either make the economy grow or protect the people from the growth of the economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding what's real, like, you know, data is biased, and especially in the healthcare space, right? Like, it's very biased. You know, the vast majority of the people that are in clinical trials look like you or me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which means that if you're African American, the likelihood of a drug not working for you is goes higher because the distribution of people that were in the clinical trial are not representative of the, they weren't represented as well. Um, and so, just as an example, is one class of one class of individuals who's not represented, who are not very well represented in clinical trials. And there's been work over the past couple of years about this, but um, there's really like things about thinking about like bias in data,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how do you lower that bias so that there's there's a equal distribution of the value of this among the population,
Mm-hmm.
uh, as an example, in sort of like the drug discovery process. And I think there's been work done around this, right? The FDA Modernization Act really created tools and rules around this. And that's a good place to think about, right? Like, how do we decrease bias
Mm-hmm.
in AI? There was like I'm not sure. Do you remember the Microsoft Connect? It was like this device that could see you,
A
right?
long time ago, yeah.
One of the early problems with it is it could not see people of dark skin, right? Like, it was just not trained on that. And so you could think about that bias being distributed across a lot of different AI models, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so, and you can think also about the fact that like AI is biased, like the modern GPT models, they're biased towards English.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Because the vast majority of what's written on the internet is written in English, right? So it's biased towards English, and it's biased towards very particular kind of English too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not biased towards, like there's a um, uh, it's like a very sort of like conventional way of speaking the English language, right? It may not
Mm-hmm.
represent folks who speak, who are from the southern part of the country, right? That speak in a slightly different manner, right? It's not it, and maybe it is, like, but it's definitely biased towards a sort of like a standardized English, and you sort of see that distributed, right? As an example,
Mm-hmm.
and so that bias is inherent in the data. And so we have to find ways to think about how do we decrease that bias, and also protecting individuals, right? Are there ways that we can build mechanisms that um, protect us from models sending us in the wrong direction?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think the fact of the matter is that anyone who thinks that privacy exists is fooling themselves. Privacy does not exist. Uh, and so, if someone really wanted to find out everything they wanted to about me, they could.
Mm-hmm.
There's all sorts of information, and it's very, unless you're living completely off the grid, it's very, very hard to have a private life. And so, by creating this sort of like privacy tools and privacy engines, you're making it actually harder for people to leverage the tools, and easier for people that are bad actors to actually do bad things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I will also say to you, here in the United States, we have, something special in relation, I would argue, to other countries where we have this kind of tug of war between, should this be a state issue? Should this be a federal issue?
I mean, it would be. I think it'd be very, very, very difficult to make this a state issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's almost difficult to make it a country-based issue, right? You know, um, I don't see how you could make this a state issue,
Mm-hmm.
except in the fact of who's in charge of the data for the state,
Mm-hmm.
right? It'd be very hard to regulate like drug development at a state level, right?
Mm-hmm.
The states like authorize doctors to practice in the state, but I think it'd be very, very difficult. I mean, you could possibly have like state approvals for certain types of algorithms, but it'd be very hard to control that,
Hmm.
right? Like very hard to control that. I don't. I mean, I could try to like. I'd have to think about mechanisms on how you would do that, but I don't think that the data aggregation. I mean, like most of the work's being funded by the federal government, so it's a federal issue, right? So NIH, NCI, right? The DoD, right? They're funding at the federal. The regulatory side, some around drug discovery, is going to be very federal. I think it's going to be hard to regulate state to state how you interact with these tools. It's like the states regulating the internet. I mean, anytime you saw that, it was just sort of like a failure. And
Hmm.
income tax, that I mean, like, sorry, sales tax, that makes sense, right? Because you can see where something's shipping from physically. But how
Hmm.
do you do that on a digital level? It's very hard.
Hmm.
I think it's very hard.
Yeah. Well, and I also think too as well. It's just hard to take what works kind of in a and this is kind of what just ping ponging it back here a little bit. Something that works in a urban area like New York might not necessarily work from an AI discovery, drug discovery standpoint in like Omaha, Nebraska, just to kind of compare, because it's totally two different parts of the country, two different sets of populations, maybe two different sets of health issues too as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very good point. And so what you're going to this is why I think like the drive towards personalized medicine really matters.
Hmm.
Um, but like you make a good point, and this is kind of what the FDA Modernization Act was trying to do. But you have to think about where these clinical trials are being run. They're
Hmm.
being run in you know where the centers, the medical centers of excellence are. They're being run at like Mass General in Boston or Memorial Sloan Kettering, or right, like you know they're being run in Texas, right, like MD Anderson. And so these are in like major urban areas.
Hmm.
And I agree with you. The health, the health issues that might happen for someone who's, a farmer in Iowa is going to be who's like maybe dealing with cattle all the time and exposed to more methane as a result of it, is going to be very, very different than someone who lives in the Bronx and is exposed to the subway and the
Hmm.
what the garbage on the street and the rats running down the road, the rats running around. I lived in New York, so this is my experience. It's a different health experience, and this is where sort of population health comes into play. But you know the the models aren't going to solve for that,
Hmm.
right? The data is, and maybe it's like you have to. This is where there's something called a digital twin, where you can
Hmm.
represent someone in a computationally mirrored way. Is where like you think about yourself. There's a digital twins of you on the internet, right? There's a digital twin of you on Netflix, right? Because
Hmm.
it's based upon your Netflix behavior. So what does a digital twin of you look like from a like a biological perspective? I think we're a little early for that. We're not we haven't cracked the code on systems biology yet. So it's a big problem, right?
Yeah.
So I still don't think like, and I'm happy to like be I'm happy to listen to as many sides of this as possible, but having been studying and researching applied AI for nearly 20 years,
Hmm.
and focus on the healthcare space for a little more than half a decade. No, almost a decade at this point. I can't see how this becomes a state issue
Hmm.
because of the necessity of the way that models work. Right? You need lots of data, and if you pull it all from one particular location, you're going to get some bias in that location. And
Hmm.
so, right, but this is why you need this is where personalized medicine is going to come into play, right? Where
Hmm.
we can actually sort of draw your blood, do a genetic swab, genomics, phenomics, name your omics, right? Do a bunch of omic testing on you, and then say, and that may help us understand not only sort of the natural, like the genetic predispositions that you have, but what were environmental impacts on you, and sort of understand um, how to like what a drug might look like that would be efficacious for you in particular,
Hmm.
to solve your particular challenge. It's actually why we as a company work on antibodies,
Hmm.
because like you have 10 to the 11th cells in your body. That's 10 with 11 zeros after. 10 to the 11 cells in your body forming antibodies all the time to protect you against everything.
Hmm.
Protect you against, I know we're doing digital, but like protect you against me breathing on you. So it's your natural pharmacy. It's your personal pharmacy. And so if we can just sort of copy off of that, find the whatever's different than what normally would be. Like you think about cancer as just sort of a regular cell that just went the wrong direction. It's a cancer cell that went bad. It's a regular cell that went bad, right?
Hmm.
Um, and we can design it specifically for you based upon what your immune system looks like. That would be a dream state for the world, from my perspective. It's something that we're aspiring to, and it may not happen in the next 100 years, but as one of my mentors once said, shoot for the moon, land on a lamppost, right? Like, we can start it and other people can follow us.
Hmm. And no, that's helpful. And where can people find more about you, Andrew, or about your company Evolve?
So for me, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just LinkedIn, I think it's just linkedin.com/Andrew Satz, but you can find me on LinkedIn. Um, and then for Evolve, just go to our website. It's EVQLV.com. Evolve is spelled in a funny way. If you ever want to know the story, I'm happy to tell it to you. I also do really think that for me, just share one last thing, because you asked me a
Hmm.
question about what should Congress know. Um, my mission in life is to bring healing and freedom to others, and
Hmm.
so that's my personal mission. And so, if I can be a resource to any Congress member that is curious about this space, that wants to understand more, to understand, to think about sort of the data space, the regulatory, minimize, like help alleviate some concerns and some fears, I'm happy to chat about it. I don't just, I have been focusing on healthcare for the, you know, almost 10 years at this point, but I have experience with applied AI across all industries, not all industries, but lots of different industries. I'm thinking about the different ways that you can apply AI for almost 20 years now, uh, you know, to problems across industries. And so if I can be a resource, not just to Congress folks, but your audience in general, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to have a chat and um, discuss ways that it can be used to really help people and create value in the world.
Awesome. Thank you again. And do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Podcast episodes are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And do not forget to check out my newsletter, the AI Healthcare Report, on LinkedIn. This is Dylan Reed signing off. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
My pleasure, Dylan. Thanks so much for having me.